answer with me. And I always think that before you start any conversation about the Holocaust, you set an intention. You either say a prayer or you add a melody or you do something that in some way is going to give us a sense, bring us into that space. So I chose something that I think also is not only reflects imagination, but inspires us. And I'd like to invite you into this, if you don't mind. In the Warsaw Ghetto, 1943 began the deportation of the Jews to Treblinka death camp. It was built only as a death camp. More than 800,000 Jews were killed there. And in the boxcars that were going to the camps that depleted almost 500,000 Jews there at that time, was Reb Azriel David Fastag. And in that crowded boxcar that he was in, he was known as a chazan, as a composer for the Moditzer Hasidic community. And he chose not to say a prayer, but to do the declaration of faith, the 12th declaration of faith at that moment. Out loud, he chose the Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema beviat HaMashiach ve'af al pi shehitmameh im kol zeh echake lo bekol yom sheyavo. He took that declaration and he composed at that time in the middle of the cattle car, the Ani ma'amin. And that we know today, the nigun, the sound, the melody. And that melody, at the same time that the entire cattle car, sorry, here, I'm going music again. That cattle car began in nigun that was never heard before. The one that we often play at, this is why I never use visual audios. And what is so important to listen to his music is that nobody at that point had ever heard this nigun, this melody. Composing in a boxcar so that the entire boxcar begins to sway together. And Fastag says something unbelievable. He says, if anybody gets out of here alive, I give half my portion of the world to come. If you would just give it to this melody that I composed, give it to the Rebbe Moditzer, who was in New York. He made that exclamation, and the group of people in the boxcar helped two young boys, escape the boxcar. We think one died almost immediately, but from 1943, when this was composed, to 1945, it was 1942, summer of 42, somebody carried this nigun, this melody with them. And a letter was received in New York from Zurich in 1945 with the notations of this melody and the story of the boxcar that was singing with a new composition of Ani ma'amin. And I'd like to help together imagine that moment in the boxcar. Not so much the boxcar, but what was Reb Fastag thinking? What was his motivation? What did he do to the other people standing there? When the two boys were able to physically at least get out of the slats and get out of that boxcar, what gift were they thinking they were carrying with them in order to survive? In order to give that gift to the world, to you and me now, that we hear this at almost every Holocaust memorial, but also the gift back to the Hasidic community, the Moditzer, who was depleted so much that they carried this with them when they received it in 1945. What difference did it make to the people in the boxcar? Do they have the imagination to wonder what happens to that melody after they're gone? Think about also Fosdag, who also said, Tim said, he also said, I'm giving half of my portion of the world to come for someone. He had nothing else. He thought he had nothing. And they knew they were going to Treblinka. They knew they were going to their deaths. By then, it was very clear in the Warsaw Ghetto what it meant in 1942. And they carry, and I want you to think about the imagination used not just to create, but to inspire and motivate, and not use a prayer, but use a declaration of faith. Use a declaration, this is how I see the world. That I'm going to be here, and I'm going to continue to hold on to faith after this. Just want to think about that for a moment, because when we start with a melody, or we start with a prayer, when we start with a psalm, we set an intention for the entire way of not only the what we do, but how it inspires others and how it lives out in the ether for the rest of the world to participate in. And I'd like to tell you a bit about the Warsaw Ghetto, because in fact, that was my training ground. Very few people, and I now 40 years later, 40 years of working on different aspects of the Holocaust and genocide and human relations and dialogue. I go back now, hark back to 40 years ago at the very, very first Holocaust museum in the world. It was set up by the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto in a place called Ghetto Fighters House, or Beit Lochamei Ghettot, in northern Israel. And I had no idea when I worked there the first 2 years that I was working there, I had no idea that I had such an extraordinary experience. I had no idea when I was 21 years old, had a BA in Jewish Studies, Holocaust Studies, and I spoke English. So for all of these talented people, all these amazing stories and history, which I'll tell you just a tip of the iceberg about, they spoke many languages among them, but English wasn't one of them. So this small little extra that I had of being an American immigrant to that country, to Israel, and interested in keeping the memory of the Holocaust alive, led me to a job. Summer, it started in the summer, the teenagers and teachers and families that were coming. So I would be the English speaking voice for Lochamei Ghettot, for the Ghetto Fighters House. And there was an incredible model of the Warsaw Ghetto and the model of the Treblinka, where each and every place was told from the point of view of not what was done to us, the Jews, but how did Jews respond? Who are we as we reacted? And all of these, what I thought elderly people at the time, I was 21, they were in their mid 50s. All these elderly people, small wizened kibbutznikim, people from the kibbutz of the land, were in the background of the archives, in the background. And they were the people I would go to ask questions. And you have to know, this incredible museum in 1977 was completely in Hebrew and Yiddish, nothing in English. So I was that English conduit for everyone else to ultimately translate and turn the entire museum into also English titles and other things. So I would go to one of these, to me, elderly 50-year-old persons and ask them questions. And just like you don't know that you have a wonderful upbringing and great parents because you don't realize what the rest of the world looks like, I had no idea that I was at that moment engaged with the survivors, the actual fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, the couriers, the kasharot, the women who were this incredible couriers between ghetto to both smuggle out information and smuggle out newspapers and find out what was happening, and ID papers and babies to non-Jewish families, but also smuggle in weapons and smuggle in books and smuggle in materials. I didn't realize that when I was asked for a period of time, because everyone was taking their turn in the kibbutz, in the ghetto fighter's house, that that each of us were sort of babysitting, spending time with, in other words, distracting the former director, because he was in such a deep, deep sorrow of the loss of his wife from cancer, that we were distracting them, that I had my turn to sit often with the former director, who they just referred to as Antic. And as I learned the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt from learning my work, this was one of the commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Itzhak Zuckerman, named Antic. And his wife, who just died, was Zivia Lubetkin, another one of the commanders of the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And the men and women of the archives would always call, Rezel, Rezel, come over here, you know, we need you, in Hebrew. And I would be the English translator of some of the most incredible requests that kept coming in from the BBC and all over. Ultimately, I became a researcher for the BBC through that work. And one of the fellows was coming in 1977, 78, was the rumors were coming out from the new immigrants from the Soviet Union that an old Swede was still in the Gulag, along with some of the Soviet dissidents. And the rumors are that it might be Raoul Wallenberg. And so the BBC came by and ultimately made a book that I was part of, Righteous Gentile. Again, I'll show any bibliography, any reference I make, any name, I will certainly give to you afterwards, if you're interested. John Bierman came by, and I was his research assistant, because I spoke English, to 60,000 pictures that Lochame Ghetto had of the Budapest ghetto, of Raoul Wallenberg, of the rescue. And I was intimately involved in telling the story of a Swedish banker who came down, got the with the ultimate blessing of using American Jewish money to come into Budapest to save the last surviving Jewish community of Europe in 1944. And as he did this, as Raoul Wallenberg did this, but more importantly, as John Bierman and I began to unfold the stories, did we begin interviewing every single survivor that was available at that time from Budapest to tell us its extraordinary stories of the imaginative approach that Wallenberg took to be able to use the system against it, because he had a goal, he had an idea, a dream. And remember, what is imagination? It's a vision. What is a vision? It's a vision for problem solving. You have an idea, a problem that has never been attached before, never been involved before. There never was such a thing as deportation of hundreds of thousands, millions of people to gas chambers before. That itself was unimaginable. In fact, when Jan Karski, the famous Polish diplomat for the Polish underground, came to the United States to give his report, the Karski report, at the end of 1943, to tell people what exactly is happening, we had the chief justice, Frankfurter, say, I'm not saying you're lying, but I don't believe you. Because it was unbelievable. It was unimaginable. As Professor Yuda Bauer, my professor at Hebrew University, would always say, the impossible became possible. So we can't think of that not happening again. It's now we set a precedent. That's what the Holocaust genocide is. So in this impossible state, the imagination to be able not only to confront it, but to use unimaginable, or let's put it this way, an imagination on how to imagine a rescue in this continued factory of death. And Wallenberg's approach, and then many others who he inspired, because it wasn't just Wallenberg afterwards. You got the entire diplomatic corps, not entire, but some of the neutrals and others, and even the Vatican involved ultimately in rescuing Jews. We often say that 30,000 were directly rescued by Wallenberg. We say 100,000 actually lived because of Wallenberg, because who he influenced with the stopping of the bombing of the by the German army of the ghetto of Budapest and other such things. And I began realizing that the imaginative mind that created hope, that created vision, that creates the possibility of above and beyond, a larger vision, a kind of possibilities that don't exist in the world because you're living in an impossible situation, which in fact is life itself, one might say. But that in fact, vision or imagination is actually the predecessor of action. You first have to have an idea, and I'm going to go back to our anima min again, an idea of what you're trying to, that you have something that's going to confront and create something much greater than that. The imaginative, and I'm going to use other imaginative approaches. We actually, just to sum up some of the pieces about Wallenberg, because the noise about Wallenberg, that he might still be alive when he was forgotten, for almost since 1947, he was forgotten. We ultimately found out that it appears that the Soviet army executed him, the Soviet executed him in 47. But the rumors that he might still be alive in 77, 30 years later, led to the commemoration, led to, if you see a Raoul Wallenberg Plaza at the UN, setting up, I was there at the dedication. We were part of a beginning of rethinking righteous Gentiles, not just the diplomats, but much more of the Hasidei Moto Olam, the righteous among the nations, at the very core of what that means, not only the rescue and the goodness and the tolerance, but what does it really mean to transform the idea of someone who would be told over and over again, it's impossible, to create a possibility. Imagine something else. Imagine a larger vision of the world that you want to live in, and then the actions you have to take for that to happen. It's interesting that in 1942, we hadn't yet declared, it was not until the end of 42, was there acknowledgement that there really was the death camps and the intended consequences of the destruction of the entire European Jewry. But in 1942, on a kibbutz, in that summer, at the same time that the noise is coming into what was called the Yeshuv, or the Palestine at the time, a man named Mordechai Shenhavi had a dream and then had a vision and imagined something that he called Yad Vashem, 1942. The mass murder of most of the Jews of Europe happened in 43, 44, and 45. And he went around, he actually had a concept of a building, he had a concept of memorial to the Jews of Europe. He had wanted a center of study. He wanted a day, Yom HaShoah, a day to remember it. They were calling it the Churban or the Shoah. And he had a path or a place in it for the non-Jews who rescued Jews. 1942. What's extraordinary is that, of course, it took a long time for it to be accepted, who would do it. He brought it to the JNF and said, JNF said, we're busy getting land and this kind of, it's not ours, KKL, different stories. But he didn't stop. And Shenhavi continued with his idea and brought it and imagined with others what that would look like, because this is the place. And one idea was in the Galilee, even Har Carmel, as Jews would be coming in and migrating to a new Israel, where they should see first the Yad Vashem, and then obviously the decision was Jerusalem. So the first place, this incredibly idea that some terrible tragedy happened to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people would immediately make a Yad Vashem, a memorial, a learning center, a gathering of the names. It was all there in 1942. And by 1953, Yad Vashem was actually, and the ideas around it, and Yom HaShoah, were decided by an act of the Knesset. The newly formed Knesset in 1948, it was fighting a war that had absorbing so many immigrants, doubling and the ultimate tripling and going on to the actual amount of citizenry it had, decided right then that Yad Vashem would be part of a Knesset decision. And already 5 years into the new state, there already was something called Memorial Day. So you realize that the International Day in 2006 was the first day they did it. First time they did it, but in 2005 they made it. How many years later? This was in 1953. But it came with an idea and a vision and imagination of a fellow named Shenhavi. You know, at the same time, we could say that about Raphael Lemkin, who created the Genocide Convention, the idea, the term genocide, and wanted a legal term because you can't, we were told over and over again that it's a wartime and we can't go in and fight for civilians. So to make it an international decision that genocide was a concept, it was an illegal act, that's an act that the world should condemn. He had a vision. He imagined this idea that law could be used to this sense and pushed it through in 1948. I always say 1948 was a good year for humanity, the State of Israel, the Genocide Convention, even the Declaration of Human Rights, the vision of Eleanor Roosevelt, imagination first to the idea that there should be something called not just a Bill of Rights for one country, but human rights for everybody who's on this tiny little globe. Everyone who's here has a right. An imaginative idea, something that never existed before, that we care about where somebody is here and somebody is there, and that's our concern too. There's something actually astronauts call the overview effect, that when you first go up into space, you look for your country, but immediately afterwards, you become an earthling. It's so extraordinary how you have this overview effect. This is something that happens when you have imagination. When you imagine something larger and greater and better than you, where it's a mindfulness that you bring to it. And in this mode that I want you to continue to begin thinking about each and every act that you've heard, particularly since we're talking about International Holocaust Day, of the moment where somebody's imagination to confront something, do it in a totally different way. And I'm just talking about the artists and the musicians and others who are creative people. They use their talents, and they use their talents also during the Holocaust. But people, ordinary people, it doesn't matter what field in science and in any kind of, that they began to think how to imagine the world differently. And what will you need to do to get there? And what is your goal for why you want it different? It's interesting, go back to Lochamei Getot. One little lady that we all were afraid of, including the other little ladies who were afraid of her, was somebody who, the name was Miriam Novich. Miriam Novich was known as the bag lady. And that's because she went with huge bags, her imagination. She pushed for the money to get a ticket to Europe. Because she was from the kibbutz, even the communist socialist countries allowed her in. And she'd knock on doors and say, there was somebody here hiding in a barrack or hiding in an attic, whatever. And he left some drawings behind. He asked me to pick them up for him. Most of the time, those artists were gone. The poets were gone. The writers were gone. But she went from place to place to cull and find the art that was left behind by victims of the Holocaust. Most of them didn't survive. She started first with a poem. She herself, or I should say more than a poem, it's a cantata by Yitzhak Katznelson in one of the French concentration camps, Gurs, and she picked it, and she went and found where it was buried. She knew about it. She was one of those who was told from the Warsaw Ghetto. And she went back after the war and dug it up, or it was it's called the Song of the Murdered Jewish People. It's one of the most important singular piece of writing that happened during the Holocaust from the perspective inside the Warsaw Ghetto, from a Jewish perspective. It emboldened her, and Miriam Novich, our friendly bag lady, went back to the ghetto, back to the kibbutz in Israel, and said, there's more out there I know. So many people, wherever they were, an artist has to do art wherever they are. there must be a lot of art. She particularly focused on the art. I would like to propose that we collect the lost art of the Holocaust. Well, if you're a historian, historians say art isn't documentation. We need history. But in fact, it was documentation, and it was the only thing that Jews had. Jews did not have cameras, were not allowed to have cameras, not allowed to, in any way from their perspective, though we do have some photographs done clandestinely. Most of the things that we see on film and in pictures are done by the Nazis. And it depends on who stands behind the camera, what they see. It was the artwork that Miriam insisted was the Jewish testimony of the Holocaust, the visualization of it, and became the very first book and one of the largest collections in the world. She called it Spiritual Resistance, Art of the Holocaust. But she and I spent a long time together because afterwards I made a BBC film called From the Bitter Earth about the artists of the Holocaust. And what was extraordinary was when everyone said no to her and thought it worthless even, that it was her idea of what it would be. In Yad Vashem and in Lochem Geto has the largest collection. And in fact, the art pieces, the visualization from the Jewish perspective and what they were able to show and how differently a child would draw versus an adult and where it was. It's way beyond Theresienstadt, what we know about Terezin, where there was artists and collected, but from every single country and every single place. And Miriam went for years back and lived on people's couches. And I had to contact people for their couches to give them, because she went with very little money, a lot of giving out of cigarettes and chocolate and whatever to various different communities in Romania and Poland and former Soviet Union and other places. But she collected and brought back our story. And if there was no Miriam, we would not have it. Piece here, piece there. We would not have a collection, and have a collection in such a way that is, in fact, allowing the survivor or the Holocaust, allow the Jew of Europe to speak, to be seen, to see it through his or her eyes. And I think of the different people along the way, that each one of them, I don't want to right away put labels on who's a righteous Gentile and who's a great Jew and who's just incredible imagination, then putting this imaginative idea into action, and then to create something that inspires the rest of us, that allows us to imagine beyond and pick up the gauntlet, so to speak, and move on. And I think about different moments in time that's so valuable for us to see and feel. And those were the first 2 years of my Holocaust experience, a Holocaust education experience. And then I began to realize that there's stories that other people have to tell. There's stories out there that we have to listen to, not just through the story, but what's the underlying layers behind the story. I'll give you an example, because I'm interested in also showing impact. And one of these stories was finally an engineer, not a very imaginative human being as far as I know, but an engineer who ultimately retired and decided to volunteer at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. And he was of that age that people would ask him, you're Jewish, you're of that age, German accent, how did you survive? And he said, I survived in Manila, in the Philippines. They rescued Jews. And people would actually say to his face, no, they didn't. Why? Why would you say that? He said, that's my story. And I know there's hundreds, if not thousands. And people say, no book has ever been written about it. No book. That didn't happen, right? So he wrote the first book. He started interviewing his family and friends, escaped to Manila, Frank. And when this came out, somebody came by and dropped it on my desk almost immediately in Cincinnati, where I was directing a Holocaust center at the time. Said, did you read this? No. He said, that's about my father. Turned out that her father was one of the Frieder brothers, Jewish family in Cincinnati, who also had import-export business in the Philippines, Manila, creating cigars. And good friends with the other expats there. Americans had a good role there, and were friendly with the President Emanu-El, the first president of the Philippines. They were in a situation where still under American jurisdiction, immigration, military, everything was still America, but they had some semblance of their own, slowly moving away into their own statehood. And these 5 brothers, in a nutshell, and we can make a whole next program just about the story of the Philippines, were able to create a rescue of 1,200 Jews before they clamped down, before the war began in the 30s. They did it in extraordinary ways. Just, you would say, these are not creative people. They're not artists, they're not designers. Where's the imagination? But the imagination to use this international business and to use every possible way to be able to bring in Jews legally meaning with the approval of the local Filipinos, with the American eye, because it still had to go through American embassies and American consulates. I'm saying this is American territory, to get around all of those things, to create the most incredible Jewish rescue of Jews in the Holocaust in the Far East. And these stories, and so, just to let you know, is that when I spent time with the Frieder family and with Frank before he passed, and others, Ralph Price, I don't know if he's here on there, but other of the children who survived in the Philippines and unfortunately had to go through the bombing of Manila and other terrible things that happened afterwards, but not as Jews, but as fellow Manilaners, they call them. From then on, we had created, just to give you just a little outcome, we created stamps between the Philippines and Israel from this. We created the major monument to the Philippines in Israel, outside of Tel Aviv. We created a whole understanding and putting this story, since he's not a righteous Gentile, Emanu-El, because to be a righteous Gentile, you had to be in the war, you had to have all kinds of show that you were risking your life or your values or your status. There's a large criteria to be a quote unquote a righteous Gentile, but to tell another story of rescue that is so incredible. Again, the details, anytime you want to. I had the privilege, I show this to you quickly. I had the privilege of being honored by the Philippine government as the highest order they had, the Order of La Candula, as a citizen for the work I did to bring the Philippine story into the public eye, to make it part of history, more than just a book or an individual, but to help others be able to understand that one good idea, that the goal is, in this case, to save people, to save as many Jews that are escaping, to give them a safe harbor, even a temporary location until it's all over, until there's someplace else to go. And that goal can then be combined by other people of goodwill. And then the story, again, compounds itself, is a possibility that only happens if you have imaginative ideas and mindfulness about what the world is and how you want the world to be different and what you can introduce to it. I want to be able to, I want to tell you maybe one other little piece. Again, these are stories that each one of them on more than an hour-long lecture and story. But I want to talk to you about the astronauts again, because one of the greatest privileges I had, and I've had many, both the people I've met, the experiences I've been through, have been given me a great amount of depth to my life and to the people I think that we've been able to touch, is the story of a little Torah. And that little Torah is a story, if you haven't yet heard, I'd love to know. If you let me know. If you have heard, it's also good to know. We also made a movie of it called The Article of Hope. But that story is about Rabbi Shimon Dasberg. Shimon Dasberg was deported from Westerbork. He was from Groningen, the Dutch chief rabbi in Holland. And in his barrack, there was a boy that was separated from his father. Happened to be that the family did happen to have papers to Palestine, to Israel, what became Israel, but he was separated from his father. He was by himself. And Shimon Dasberg came to him and said, "How old are you?" His name was Yoya. Yoya said, "I'll be 13 soon. I'll be 13 in March." And he said, "Let's do a bar mitzvah. Wouldn't you be a bar mitzvah?" He said, "Here? Now? This place, Bergen-Belsen?" He said, "Why not? I have a Torah. It's a Torah size of my hand. I have a Torah. These are the Torahs that were in the early 20th century. B'nai Brak did handwritten little traveling Torahs for the tourists that came in and could travel with a full kosher Torah and have the be able to do the parshot wherever they were, have a real Torah with them." He brought it in with him, Dasberg, into Bergen-Belsen. He imagined what that did for that boy. What did it do for the inmates who scrambled to find bar mitzvah gifts? A couple pieces of chocolate, mittens, piece of bread, whatever it was. In that barrack, they were also able, with the imagination and the network, because in every concentration camp, in every place, there's some kind of network and everything, able that on the day of his bar mitzvah, that evening of the bar mitzvah, where the boy would chant his Torah portion in front of the barracks, the barrack, inside a male barrack, in front of the other barrack mates with Rabbi Dasberg, they were able to even recruit the mother from the women's clap to sneak her in as a male to listen outside the window. Bar mitzvah is over. Shimon Dasberg says to Yoya, Yochiam Yosef was his name, they called him Yoya, "I'm giving you this Torah." So I'm giving the nigun, the melody, right? In Strumlinka, I'm giving you this Torah with the promise that you say, tell this story that you were bar mitzvahed even in Bergen-Belsen. Yoya survived. Shimon Dasberg did not. They say he was shot as he was doing Aleim Rachamim over dead inmates. And he comes out, and years later, he becomes, in his 60s, he becomes an astrophysicist, and he is the astrophysicist that's responsible for the Israel space program and helps lead Ilan Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, to his responsibilities and to his understanding of what he has to do in space. Ilan is in his home, and he sees this little Torah on the shelf, and he asks, demands the story. Interesting, because Ilan's mother was a survivor of Auschwitz. Yoya says, "I feel so bad. I really didn't do what the rabbi asked me to do." After he finishes the story, "I didn't tell the world." The imagination kicks in. And Ilan Ramon comes back to him. He said, "I got permission. It's a go. We're going to tell the world." So what are you talking about? Ilan Ramon asked permission to bring the Torah up into space, not in the little shoebox that they usually take little mementos up into space, but take it into the space shuttle with him, Space Shuttle Columbia. And on a Shabbat morning, with the Torah floating, Ilan Ramon told the story of a Torah in space, a Torah of bar mitzvah in Bergen-Belsen. He told the world. Took this idea, the imagination of Shimon Dasberg, to help that little boy survive because he had to keep that Torah going and to keep the Torah alive. Obviously, this Torah, along with Ilan Ramon, on February 1st, we created it's interesting, we even called it Vision back then. We created a special story about Ilan Ramon taking the Torah in space and then created a whole program around it, to the point that what we did, again, in my Holocaust Center, but in the idea, the inspiration, the imagination of him to do this, the imagination of Dasberg to give him Yoya, the conduit, this story and this privilege and the reason to exist and the reason to survive. He had a mission, so to speak, that we ultimately, I hope the light doesn't show on this too much, we ultimately sent the Torah, a second Torah up in space 3 years later with the Atlantis, with the non-Jew, a similar Torah from B'nai Brak from the early 1900s, given to us by a Holocaust survivor from Holland. And that Torah was brought back safely with the idea that we would continue to inspire others. As Stephen McLean became head of the Canadian Space Agency. And the story of him fulfilling the mission of his friend Ilan Ramon, who was destroyed and killed in the space shuttle disaster, Columbia. He fulfilled for the passing on of, I will tell the story and I will bring it back safely. I will bring the Torah back safely into your life. I want to end this, my portion anyway, before you have any questions, with one more story, because tomorrow's Tu B'Shvat. Tomorrow happens to be Tu B'Shvat. It doesn't always coincide that the two are together. Forgive me, I always get emotional, which never ceases to amaze myself or my family, because Mom, you've been doing it for 40 years. But never cease to be amazed is that the city of Cincinnati, the opera, had chosen to put on for children the children's opera called Wunderbar that was created in Prague, and then because the creator, the composer, was thrown into Theresienstadt, we call it Terezin. Theresienstadt is the ghetto, the concentration camp outside of Prague, where the Jews of Prague and other German Jews were sent to. They recreated Wunderbar inside the ghetto of Terezin. Now, the reason, something quite special, lovely idea to bring this opera back to life. And one of the performers in this children's opera was Ella Weisberger. And Ella was invited by Cincinnati to sing along with the children, to witness it, come back, and we were, in fact, privileged. She was the cat in the story, Wunderbar. But something unique to us, she's appeared in many places, but something unique to us, she came around the time of Tu B'Shvat. And I asked her if she would plant a tree with us on the Hebrew Union College campus that would remember the 1.5 million children who died in the Holocaust. I'll tell you two pieces of this. The first piece of the story, the imagination, in my case, it's my imagination, that we would be able to create a forest for 1.5 million Jewish children. And I thought that there must have been one. It's a kind of thing that JNF would have done a long time ago, I thought, because we plant trees when people pass. Trees are for climbing, it's for tomorrow, it's got all these things, but they didn't have one. So we were initiating the very first JNF forest and you can get these today, right now. It's a forest for the 1.5 million children who passed in the Holocaust. And we wanted Ella to plant a tree for us. And she says, I have to tell you, Razel, we planted a tree for Tu B'Shvat in 1943 in the Terezin ghetto. I said, it's not written anywhere. And if it isn't written, us historians don't know what to do with that, right? She said, I will tell you, we planted a tree. It was coming, for the first time, most of us had very little Jewish education. We were assimilated Jews, us German Jews, the Czech Jews, we were assimilated. We didn't know a lot of the major Jewish holidays, let alone the minor Jewish holidays. And our Zionist youth leaders are the ones who took over the children's barracks. And the story of the children's, the incredible creations that came out of there. And one of our leaders tells us about the birthday of trees and decides to smuggle in a tree, a little maple tree, into Terezin so we can have Tu B'Shvat in Terezin. Now, think about that. Most people, imagination of this teacher, most people will talk, well, we're having a party, we'll smuggle in cake. We'll ask for food, right? Or warm mittens for everybody, or socks. when you study happiness, when you study the actual science of happiness, when you eat your ice cream, it's over. But if you do something that captures your imagination, it lasts and lasts. The idea of these children planting a tree together, and we know what trees symbolize. We know what Tu B'Shvat symbolizes. In the middle of them, imagine that crazy, the guard who must have been bought off, or the worker who was a Gentile worker who said, these Jews want a tree. What do they want a tree for? They bought a tree, and they had Tu B'Shvat. And she learned about Chag Ilanot, and she learned the songs. So when she made Aliyah at the Weisberger, she knew how to sing the song. Years later, my teachers went to Terezin and did a trip there and brought back for me some of the seeds from that tree to honor me. And they brought back many more than the ones that are here now, because 3 years later, there was an incredible flooding in that area of Czechoslovakia, I should say the Czech Republic. And that tree was destroyed, the roots were destroyed. And geneticists asked me from Prague to send some of these seeds back to them so they could have the original tree, the original seeds to plant that tree all over again. The children planted in Terezin in 1943. That's a Tu B'Shvat story for you. But I want you to understand, I want to invite you to understand that the motivation to continue to discover and unfold, there was just a discovery this week of 10 tefillin for any kind of minyan. They discovered in a bunker that was never known about in Poland until they started excavating last week. How they find them, where they found up, it's not important, but what's important is the amount of imagination of people to persevere, to imagine, not to allow the world and its despondency and its cruelty and all the other words that we would use to be your narrative, that you imagine beyond that. No one has said it better, of course, many times over. He actually called himself an artist. He said, I'm enough of a person. Everyone knows this one. Here's our friend, right? Here's our friend. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Buddy, this is on my wall. The imagination really goes beyond what is our limited knowledge about anything. Limited knowledge about viruses, little knowledge about politics, limited knowledge about the environment. It is the imagination that is going to kick in on each impossible to create possibilities that we don't know. I sometimes imagine not the 2/3 that were taken from us, but the third that live beyond that. A third of the Jewish population live beyond that with untold amount of ingenuity in their survivorship, untold amount of experiences of people, Jews, Gentiles, others that were part of and inspired by your story. I just read yesterday that 850 centurions in Israel that were Holocaust survivors. 850 people over the age of 100 that are Holocaust survivors. Extraordinary. So I wanted to leave with you just this little piece of imagination, the limitlessness, not only of being an earthling, the overview effect, but the possibilities that imagination created to create a single rescue, a single baby who was born during that time to live, a single song to get to us, a melody, a single photograph, a single picture, an idea like the Yad Vashem came from imagination, of thinking outside the box, as people say, of thinking beyond and over much more than our knowledge. And I would encourage, because I always am the teacher, that we should teach towards creating and developing our imagination of children and adults, that imagination with good morals could actually conquer most of the things that are our maladies. Thank you.
Rousseau, Fantastic job. I'm also going to ask Janet to unmute. If anybody has comments, questions, if you can send them to the chat, I will field them and present them to Rochelle. So feel free to send any chat. While you're doing that, I'll tell you that I had one already. This is, I think, from our, let me see where this is. Uh, the Scotland people that are on ask if I could just share. There is, and it just came through her, Holocaust Memorial Day in Scotland. It's an online ceremony, and there is a YouTube on that. I won't forward this right now, but it's a YouTube. If you look at YouTube, I'm sure for Scotland Holocaust ceremony, you'll be able to find that on YouTube. The Let's see. I heard, a thank you from Maureen. Oh, Priya and David, I bet you know them. I thought it was amazing. Many traits can be cultivated to strengthen these beautiful stories and thinking of Israel's success, especially relative to size. Makes me think the Jewish collective mind has really sharpened its practice of imagination. Even the rollout of the COVID vaccine, for example, was so efficient. A different type of imagination.
25% Nobel Prizes.
All right, somebody is unmuted right now. All right. The Interfaith Scotland YouTube, HMD 2021, that was in there. Thank you for touching a personal presentation from Roberta Burson. Benita, thank you, Rochelle, for all your efforts to inform us in your way of using imagination to bring about change and hope. Jake's iPhone, very nice. Thank you for including the Alabama contingency. And others may still be coming in. So those are the chats I have right now. Again, it was eye-opening to hear a lot of your view on imagination and the view on what people were able to do. And I think the hope that it could give people. Truly great.
Yeah.
Not seeing any other chats coming right now. We'll give another minute. Here, thank you so much. Invaluable information from Sylvia Epstein. Toda Rabah. We all need imagination from Sarah Sherman. Here's one from Al Munzer. My mother survived by seeing spring through the cracks of cattle care. Amazing. Here, a question. What do you think makes someone a hero when others are not able to be?
I want to say imagination. One of the most important parts of my career, I spent to what created the people, the impetus and the ability to help. We call it helpers, the righteous among the nations. What were the motivating forces, and what did all of them have in common? And we saw that we call them brave, but they didn't feel that they were brave, and they didn't feel they were courageous. Most of them already had a good sense of it was the right thing to do. And we don't yet create enough, I think, teaching enough of what's the right thing to do in these cases, the worth of a person, the worth of every child, the worth of every. But I think that after they said it's the right thing to do, and we've had that in all of the research done on those who asked, why did you do it? And they said, why, how could I not? So it was a compelling moment for them where they basically had what we call at least 4, possibly 5 different attributes that were in common. The attributes of rescue usually had to do with optimism. Using the word optimism, and if somebody may sound like a perennial, sarcastic pessimist, but you couldn't save someone if you didn't think that you would succeed. And therefore you had to say, and often when you ultimately ask someone, well, tell us about this world, and they say that actually Nazism is an aberration. The world was good before, the world can continue to be good, and I'm going there. You have to have a view that the world can be and is a better place. So we saw that you have to instill a sense of that action and word and deed matters, and that you can, in fact, create the change that you're talking about. It's not just words. These are very important, and it has to be done through action. It was the idea also, which we find very interesting, that a great sense of self, their sense of self-worth. So these, what we call heroes, were people that actually said, why not me? And it also is at that point that hero said, what we call heroes, and I do call them heroes, but we're using a word, a term that they themselves may not use to themselves. I had an opportunity. I was given this option. A baby was placed in my care. A person knocked on my door, to the point of, or while Wallenberg was approached by a committee of Jews. I was asked to do a deed that I knew was right to do. And how could I not do it? And that kind of person has a sense of self-worth, because a person who feels that they themselves are valueless, who am I? But he didn't say, who am I? It's a more, what am I? I think that besides the self-worth and a sense of optimism, you also saw that those people had role models. They saw it before somewhere. They were able to taste it. So I want to talk about imagination. This is why I tell these stories. Because if a child anywhere, it doesn't matter affluent or poor, if they are poor in their ability to have real good role models, then they'll never be able to do anything themselves because they don't think it's possible. But if they see role models, and I'm not talking about actresses or basketball players, they can tell us some things, but a role model of behavior, if you really see a tolerant, kind, compassionate, if they see a Malala, or if they see somebody else that they see a role model, that's what inspires them to more or greater. And every one of these people used a role model. Often it was a parent. So good parenting is extraordinarily important, but sometimes it was a priest or a teacher. These are people in leadership roles that we undervalue and are so important. So every time we did the research, we did major research at University of Haifa on righteous among the nations from France, from Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. And we found a consistency of behavior that they could first point to a role model that would have done that if they were given this opportunity to rescue a Jew. And many of them didn't even know Jews or even know the Jew that they rescued. And it goes on and on. So I want to just use those three things: role models, sense of optimism and hope, and a real sense of self-worth is very important. As Viktor Frankl says in his Man's Search for Meaning, that meaning and purpose adds a lot to life. The first time many people said, don't thank me, the Jews of Denmark, when the chief rabbi of Denmark came back and said, thank you for saving the 7,000 Jews of Denmark. He said, don't thank you. It was the only thing that we can lift our heads up during this horrible war. So these are people who gave it purpose and meaning to do something valuable. So we see heroes understanding there's purpose and meaning and value in life, sense of self-worth, a sense of hope, which is optimism, real sense of, not from the mouth, but from the heart, sense of hope. And a sense that things are possible, an open-minded world, their possibilities, and that's where the imagination comes in. So I'm using these four cornerstones. If we could teach those four things to the children now, to imbue, and even adults today that are always learning, lifelong learning, we would be able to move mountains.
Excellent answer. A couple other comments and question. One, thank you, Rochelle. I've read and heard a great deal about the Holocaust. You've suggested a whole new dimension for moving towards feeling the enormity and thinking of ways not just of survival of the body, but of the soul and the core of human dignity, heart and imagination. Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Another one, Einstein never ceases to amaze me. His acknowledgement of God, his admiration for imagination are probably the main reasons he was such an accomplished scientist. So interesting you brought Einstein into this. And then another one here, excellent presentation with the question. Do you know about Herman Siemens, righteous Gentile from Holland?
I do not know that name.
Okay. I'll ask who, I don't have more information on who sent that. It's being cut off here, so I'll ask them to get in touch with you directly with that. For Marla, thank you for the Tu B'Shvat story. I'll share it at our Zoom Tu B'Shvat Seder tomorrow. Wish I had known that when I went Terezin, when we went to the Czech Republic. Yeah, so good story. A lot of good stories in there for sure.
Well, there are more. Everyone needs a bathroom break. But the joy of meeting these people and finding, or meeting these stories, or in some way stumbling across, to me, it invites. I want to thank you, Janet and Bob and the community, for inviting me in, because sometimes you're bursting with wanting to share. And you say, it's selfish of me to have kept it to myself this long, without sharing it with all of the limitations of COVID and everything else. At least this gives us an opening.
We're very, very grateful that you shared with us today, Rachel. Really, it's so much that we learned, that we all learned from you. And we hope we can do it again in the future, because I know you have a lot more to tell us. So we are very appreciative on behalf of the temple
Well, thanks.
and whoever's here today.
Okay.
So,
All right, thanks.
thank you.
Everyone. We'll
Thank
call this end to the session. Super job.
Okay.
Thank you, Shalom. And I hope that everybody is peaceful, healthy, and remains optimistic.
Amen.
You're here.
Okay, that was great.